Okay, so today we're going to talk about Chapter 10, Children with Autism. So we always start out with a little bit of the history of the field. And we know that someone who's very, very famous for first describing autism and autism characteristics is a person by the name of Leo Kanner. So we first hear about autism from Leo Kanner. And we first hear about Asperger syndrome, which some people believe is a subset of autism. Some say it's its own particular disability. But when we look at the diagnostic and statistical manuals that describe disability, we see that they are grouped together as a spectrum. So, a spectrum of autism. We have Asperger's being identified in 1944. But unfortunately, just like other disabilities, we've blamed parents. And before we really had a sense of the research on autism and causes and which we're sort of still grappling with, but we blamed mothers in particular, and they were referred to as refrigerator mothers who were not perhaps as attentive or as attached to their children. We do get a distinguished differentiation between autism and Asperger's finally, not so long ago, but in 1981. Prior to that time, we just really identified autism, and a lot of the times we didn't distinguish between intellectual disabilities and autism. So that was a problem as well, particularly for children with autism who really are quite different than our children who have intellectual disabilities. And so autism became a category under the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act not until 1990. And we know from our first chapter that the first federal law, the Education for All Handicapped Children Act, occurred in 1975. So you'll see that we did not really separate out autism as a category until 1990 when we renamed the law as the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, and in that time added two categories of disability to the original 10. We added autism and traumatic brain injury. And then in 1994, autism was added to the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual 4. We're now up to the Diagnostical and Statistical Manual 5, but under the area of, we added autism to that manual as well. So what's the definition under IDEA? Well, it's a developmental disability that affects verbal, so it affects a child's communication greatly, and nonverbal communication. It affects social interactions and generally is evident before the age of 3 when a child's becoming more social, although we are starting to see some characteristics in infants. But again, like every other disability, a child does not get special education unless it impacts the child's educational performance. So understanding the umbrella, we refer to it as the umbrella of autism, and sometimes you'll see actual umbrella symbols on, actually on cars and on T-shirts. But the umbrella of autism, again, it's a developmental disorder. So it happens in a child's developmental years. It's sometimes referred to as PDD, and under PDD, we have actually full-blown autism. We have Asperger's, and then sometimes you'll see a child, a very young child in particular, with the diagnosis of PDD NOS, it should say actually, not PBD. PDD NOS, pervasive developmental disorder not otherwise specified. So what are the prevalence of autism? So we know that we are seeing an increase in children with autism, and there is some different ideas as to why that is so. We know that there's better ways to assess and diagnose children now than there was in the past. But the estimate, again, it's a low estimate. Even though everyone's concerned with autism and there's strong advocacy for autism, it is not the highest category of disability served in the school population. So there is this controversy about the prevalence related to autism. What are some causes? Well, just like any other disability, we have biological, we have neurological, or brain-based, and environmental. Um, we do see generations of families with children with autism, with persons with autism. There's sometimes a higher frequency of siblings or twins. We see that in our study of the brain and genes, there's no single gene that we've identified yet that's responsible, although we do see abnormalities in the brain, particularly in the area of the brain that deals with communication. There's controversy over immunization, but pretty much we know at this point that vaccinations do not cause autism. That was actually a large report was done by doctors in England who were actually faking the data. And so certainly you can understand why that's a problem, because many families then refuse to have their children vaccinated. What are some common characteristics of children with autism? Well, difficulty in the area of social, so relating to others. There's a wide range of problems in the area of communication. There's their insistence on rigidity and environmental the sameness. Some children will actually end up having behavioral problems if things in the environment are changed, such as taking a different route in the car to school. There's sometimes what's referred to as stereotypic behavior, repetitive rocking or flicking things, or moving things back and forth, so self-stimulatory behaviors. The cognitive and academic characteristics consist of cognitive abilities varying very widely. You have certainly children with autism who are quite capable of keeping up with the general education curriculum, but others who will suffer greatly in terms of cognition. There's an over-reliance, though, on this rigidity and this roteness, so rote memory. Problems with abstract thinking or theory, problem-solving challenges, and sometimes problems in motivation. The social-emotional is really greatly impacted. So again, problems with expressive language, problems with receptive language, problems with communicative intent, getting out the message they're trying to get out. Asperger, there might be problems with naming things. So the problems are different for children with full-blown autism versus children with Asperger's. And there could certainly be levels of immaturity in terms of social and the emotional piece. The behavior characteristics, again, self-stimulatory behaviors. That's the repetitive movement or rocking. Generalization difficulties. So what that means is the child doesn't always show that they can generalize things across settings. They might be okay in one setting, but not in another. And sensory issues cause behavioral problems, such as when a noise is too loud or lights are too bright. How do we assess children with autism? Well, certainly we use formal assessments as well as informal. So standardized assessments and classroom-based assessments. We assess their intellect, so their cognition, their academic achievement, how they adapt. There's a lot of behavioral assessments done as well as development measures. In early childhood, we do see sometimes intervention prior to age 3, but we really are seeing intervention when the diagnosis of autism is made, and sometimes that is not made until around age 2 or 3. A lot of times there's intensive intervention. There can be interventions such as referred to as applied behavioral analysis, or ABA, and they may take place in both the school and the home and be anywhere from 20 to 45 hours a week. A lot of times there has to be active family involvement in the direct intervention by highly trained staff. So teachers may be trained in a number of things related to children with autism. There's ongoing assessment related to progress, and there has to be systematic implementation of curricula. So it can't be just catch as catch can with these children in terms of implementation. It has to be systematic in nature. There has to be support in all environments, and there is definitely a big focus on communication goals. Many of these children will have speech-language pathologists involved really early on in their careers. There's help for these students in applying skills across settings, so that generalization piece is very important. Individualized interventions, a lot of times behavior intervention plans, as well as academic intervention plans, and transition planning, transition from early childhood to school, and then school to middle school, and then high school, and then out to after school. Autism inclusion collaboration model components. So if we're looking to include children, we need definitely cooperation in terms of the environment and curricular modifications between general and special education. There has to be an attitude that the child can learn, and as well as social support. So the multidisciplinary team has to be coordinated. There has to be coordination and collaboration between the home and the school. When we're talking about the older child with autism, we're focusing on work. So work or college after high school. Self-help skills. Many of these children are going to need help with budgeting and shopping. Play and leisure and recreation. We all need those things. Social skills, sexuality, and how to run their household. The recommended educational practices, environmental supports will include such things as visual reminders to the child, both in the home and the school. The child may rely on assistive technologies if their communication is so impaired that they need assistive technology to communicate. Instructional practices, we are using priming or prompting, previewing, transitioning, sometimes very highly trained curriculums such as discrete trial training. In the area of social skills, we are using such things as social stories. So that's individual stories based on the child's needs. One child we made a social story on recently to help him to successfully move from the school to his bus after school because he was having behavior problems in between. So we want to remember this acronym if possible. I'm not sure how to pronounce it. SOCSIS. Situation, options, consequences, choices, strategies, and stimulation. So in the area of social skills support, we need to figure out the situation, give the child some options and the team the options, teach consequences, provide choices, strategies, and pay attention to simulations. Simulations, role-playing, not stimulation, but we need to be concerned with stimulation too, in terms of too much or too little. In terms of perspective of parents and families, families definitely need support and they need early intervention. The role of parenting is very demanding for this child, any child, but particularly for a child with disability. Siblings may need support too. All right, so siblings play an important role, and we need to understand the sibling relationship, and we need appropriate resources. What are the current needs in the area of autism in the field? Better techniques for early diagnosis. We need research-based and evidence-based interventions in the home and the classroom, and more programs to train professionals and teachers. And that takes us through our chapter on autism.